All right, so if you're watching this video, you're wondering, how does podcasting work? How do I get my podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? I think the best way for me to explain it is to show you what it's like. So I'm going to grab a microphone and do some screen recording and show you how a podcast gets made and then distributed all the way to Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to need is this microphone. You can see I have this windscreen here, and I'm going to set this pretty close to my face. The windscreen is just an inch or two from the microphone, and I'm going to put my mouth pretty close to this, and I'm also going to use some headphones just to listen to myself while I record. And that's going to be the first step. I'm going to record my podcast episode. So I've got GarageBand open here, which is free on Macs. And there's software like Audacity on the PC that you can use as well. You can even, if you want, plug a microphone into your phone and use your sound recording app on your phone. I would recommend, however, getting a good microphone. And there will be some links below that you can check out for some good starter microphones that won't cost you too much. All right, so I'm going to be using this microphone here, and I'm going to click Create. And so you can see my audio track right here. I'm going to start by recording a trailer episode. This is a short episode that is kind of like the promo for the podcast as a whole. So to get started, I'm just going to hit this record. Hello, everyone. I am Justin Jackson, and this is my travel podcast. Follow along as I journey around the world to countries like Japan, Scotland, and Canada. I'll tell you my favorite spots to stay and my favorite spots to eat. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. All right, so that's basically an episode right there. If I want, I can cut off that intro spot and I can listen back. Everyone, I am Justin Jackson. Now, I could add music to this if I want. I could fade in or fade out. But this, to me, sounds like a good intro episode. So I'm going to export this as an MP3 file. And I'm going to choose 128 kilobits per second. And we'll just export that. All right, so now we've created the MP3. The next thing every podcast needs is an RSS feed and a place to host that MP3 file we just recorded. And that's where you're going to need a podcast hosting provider like Transistor. So I'm going to log into Transistor. You see I have lots of other podcasts here. If I click in on any of these, you can see all of the episodes I've recorded for other shows. But I'm going to create a brand new podcast here. And we're going to call it Justin's Travel Show. Follow along as I travel to countries around the world. And another thing every podcast needs is cover art. This is a square about 3,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels. I've got one ready here. And this will help people see your podcast when they're browsing through Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So next up, I'm going to choose my category, and this is going to be places and travel. If you're going to be in Apple Podcasts, you need to choose a primary category. You can also choose a secondary category. I'll choose personal journals. These fields here, show owner and owner email, is how Apple determines the owner of the podcast. So if they need to contact you for any reason, they'll contact you at that email address. I'm going to click Create. All right, now I've created a podcast and I can upload that first episode I recorded earlier. So I'm going to put introduction. I'm going to publish this right now. And I'm going to browse for that MP3 file. There it is. Here I'm going to have a short summary. What's this show about? And down here I can have longer show notes. So I might have links. So we might put Justin's website, Justin's Instagram. And this is a trailer episode, like I mentioned. So I'm going to choose that as my episode type. going to click create. So now I have one episode uploaded, and this is where that RSS feed comes into play. So if I head back here on Transistor, I can see my show's RSS feed. And this is what you'll need to use to submit to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc. And all an RSS feed is a list of episodes that you have created and published with a link to your MP3 file. A lot of folks think that you just upload your podcast directly to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, but you actually need a podcast hosting provider like Transistor to host your MP3 files. That's happening here, and to generate this RSS feed. Now, we make our RSS feeds look really pretty, but if you were to look at the source code for this, you'd see all of this XML that basically describes your podcast for services like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. So the title that I put in my show settings shows up there, as well as my description. And down here, we can see that first episode that I created. And so a good way to visualize this is that you upload your audio to a service like Transistor. We then update your RSS feed with that new episode, and all of the services like Apple Podcasts, etc., are always kind of refreshing your feed to see if there's new episodes. And when they detect that there's a new episode, they'll update their app and update all of the listeners around the world who have subscribed to your show on their app. So if I go back to GarageBand and record a second episode, I can then upload that. Let's do that now. Scotland. And I'll upload episode 2 and add my show notes here. And again, any links or anything else I'd like to include. When I create this episode, it publishes automatically to that RSS feed. Let's refresh, and there's episode 2. And so every time I add a new episode, the RSS feed gets updated, and then all of the other apps that know about the podcast also get updated. Now, how do you submit your podcast to all of these apps? Well, in Transistor, you can submit directly to Spotify. We have a direct integration with them. But Apple Podcasts still has a manual submission process, and you'll need to go to Podcast Connect for that. I've got the link to this down below. And you'll need an Apple ID, and this is where a lot of folks get tripped up. The Apple ID needs to be verified in iTunes, either on your phone or a desktop, which can be tricky for PC users that might not have those things. But you'll need an Apple ID, and once you log in, you'll get to a screen like this where you can add a new feed. So we'll go back to Transistor here. We'll grab our RSS feed, paste it in, we'll validate that. And you can see Apple's pulling in all of this metadata, right? We've got all of my categories, and here's the 2 episodes I've published. It's pulling in all of this information in my RSS feed. And now I can click this submit button, and Apple will review my podcast and decide if they want to let it into Apple Podcasts. And that process can take up to 5 days. They'll manually review each submission. So make sure you keep that in mind if you've got a specific launch date in place. You only need to do this submission process once. So once Apple has approved your podcast, every single time you add a new episode, it will update your RSS feed, and Apple will automatically pick it up and distribute it to all of the folks who have subscribed to your podcast, or all of the folks who might just be browsing on Apple Podcasts and find your show. Most podcast hosting providers also have analytics for your podcast. So once you've been publishing for a while, you'll be able to see, how many downloads or listens do you get over time, which are your most popular episodes, and what podcast players are people using to listen to your podcast? Is it Apple Podcasts or Spotify? And even where in the world folks are listening from. And that's essentially it. That's how podcasting works. If you have any more questions, you can reach out to me at mail@transistor.fm, or you can visit transistor.fm and open the little chat widget, and I'm happy to answer your questions.